This week's review was originally going to be about Honey Don't, and then I saw Honey Don't.
No one knows what it is. It's like this mad riddle that no one knows what it is, right?
Hi, I'm LadyJenevia. I'm Japanese, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Being that I decided not to review my originally intended topic, this has been swapped in at the last minute. Now, I had already picked out Marighella for my next Brazilian movie review, but I had not decided when I would actually review it. But we're here now, we're doing this, so let's go.
I would say Brazil.
Marighella is a 2019 historical drama that's mostly meant to focus on the Afro-Brazilian revolutionary Carlos Marighella. But more broadly speaking, it's also covering various events of revolutionary rebels fighting back against the US-backed military dictatorship in Brazil. This film was also the directorial debut of Brazilian actor Wagner Moura. I did a quick skim of some of the viewer feedback, copied and pasted a couple of reviews into Google Translate. By the way, if anyone knows of an alternative online translation option that isn't Google, please share those recommendations in the comments, because as much as I can, I'm trying to find ways to move away from bigger corporations. It's not easy.
One of the lessons is caveat emptor.
Anyway, the feedback among Brazilians that I seemed to find was mixed. The impression that I got from the questionable search engine translations I did was that some Brazilians were not entirely pleased with the execution of this story, and even some of the stylistic choices of how to talk about Carlos Marighella and all that he did and all that he believed. I will talk about a very small amount of that because I do not regard myself as someone who is qualified to lead that type of discussion, but I will simply share my perspective of how I experienced the film and the beginnings of my own explorations into Carlos Marighella as a historical revolutionary. My film review pull quote is as follows. Though the film would have benefited from exploring further into the earlier origins of Carlos Marighella, a mesmerizing performance from Seu Jorge makes this a worthy introduction to the Afro-Brazilian revolutionary. Before I get into some of the specifics, I do want to say that even though I have some mixed feedback, overall I am going to log this film as fresh because in my impression, there are enough things that are great about the film that ultimately tip the scales towards a favorable rating as opposed to a negative one. First and foremost, like I said, Seu Jorge gives a beautiful performance. There's a decent range in the more outward expression of emotions, but also everything that is more internal and things that you can only gauge by the subtle details of his performance. The relationship between Marighella and his son, the strong love that they have for one another, that was yet another major strength of the film. The part where these revolutionaries were able to successfully pull off a rebel stunt to get Marighella's message broadcast across Brazil, that was also very cool. But one of the recurring points that seemed to come up in the translations I read through of Brazilian comments was that they seemed to feel as if Marighella's ideology had either been watered down or underdeveloped. From my point of view, when I consider how the title of the film is Marighella, I was left feeling as though there somehow wasn't enough of Marighella's history in his own movie. See, when you have a film with the title being the name of your protagonist, there's probably going to be a conscious or subconscious expectation that you're going to learn a fair bit about the history of that person, who was so monumental that it ultimately warranted an entire film being greenlit about them. To be fair, though, you don't have to approach every historical biographical drama in the film medium the same way. You can take an approach like Baz Luhrmann's Elvis, where you are covering a lot of major events beginning in childhood, his professional rise, the highs and lows of his professional and personal life, leading all the way to his eventual death. Conversely, you could take an approach like Judy, where you're telling a story about Judy Garland, but that film was mostly focusing on the final year of Judy Garland's life, where she went to London to do a residency of performing on stage. But even that film has flashbacks to her childhood, making The Wizard of Oz, because those things were important to making her current struggles with substance abuse and her general emotional and psychological well-being struggling make sense for the primary narrative of that film on its own. Although there might be an expectation that a lot of the people who would choose to go and watch the film, Judy, are people who are already familiar with various key details about Judy Garland's life, the film is also designed so that it can fill in those blanks for the viewers who are not as knowledgeable about Judy Garland's history. For Marighella, this is something that I don't think the film did as well as I would have liked. Now, a Brazilian anti-imperialist audience is unlikely to need as many of those historical details filled in. The knowledge is already in their minds. But for me, a person who is not Brazilian, but is very interested in learning more, which is why I'm watching the film in the first place, I would have liked to see more details about the history of his life, his work, the development of his ideology, and so on and so forth, actually play out on screen. Now, this wasn't an issue of disliking the film. I did like the film, but I know that I could have liked it more if some details, such as what I just mentioned, had been adjusted. Now, art is subjective, and anything that is more provocative or explicit is more likely to be divisive or controversial. And I want to be extremely careful with my words here because this film is covering a very violent, traumatic chapter of Brazilian history, so I really don't want anyone to misunderstand my feedback of the film. I have watched a couple of films now and then reviewed them on my channel, in which the military dictatorship of Brazil is a major part of the story. We had Ainda Estou Aqui, O Que É Isso, Companheiro, and O Beijo da Mulher Aranha. Marighella is significantly more violent in how much it shows of what Brazilian civilians and revolutionaries were subjected to. There is an extremely long sequence of one of Marighella's comrades being captured and tortured by Brazilian police, or maybe they were secret police. A film, specifically a historical one, is different from other forms of historical media, such as a novel, a textbook, or even a documentary. More than any of those other mediums, a film is going to be limited by things like needing to present a dramatic narrative that makes sense for the medium, and also having to consider the runtime. On the longer end of things, maybe you'll see some films that are 3 hours or 3.5 hours, but generally speaking, making use of whatever the runtime is in an optimal way is extremely important for making feature films. You're setting out to do a dramatized retelling of the life, ideology, and actions of the revolutionary Carlos Marighella, and as I've already said, I at times had this feeling that even though I liked what I was seeing, I also wanted more. The screenplay, I feel, would have benefited more from covering additional details of Marighella's history. It would have been more educational to the audience, but also just in the context of this being a feature film and what you need to do in the film medium, you could have had a more developed protagonist if you had either widened the scope of his life story or, at the very least, included some flashbacks to give that insight into who he is and what motivates him. Any of the Brazilians who have been around here on my channel, you will already know this, but if you are new, this is a true story. When I watched Ainda Estou Aqui, I was so emotionally distressed that when I came home from the cinema, I had to watch Mamma Mia just to try to make myself emotionally recovered enough to start to write a review of Ainda Estou Aqui. And in that film, you don't see anywhere near as much of the type of brutality or torture that they do show in Marighella. It's made very clear what the people of Brazil were subjected to in Ainda Estou Aqui, as well as all the other Brazilian films I've mentioned. And none of those films needed to show that level of violence and sadism on screen to tell stories about more or less the same topic, and they still had a significant impact and honesty in addressing that really sensitive historical trauma. Now, I understand that not everyone has the same level of sensitivity to violence in film, so if you didn't find it excessive, of course that's okay. Like I said earlier, I still rate the film favorably overall. I am simply saying that when you have a limited amount of minutes to tell your story, I would have preferred that more of that screen time be spent on covering the history of Carlos Marighella instead of a really long, drawn-out attack of racist torture. If someone is captured by the police and then you cut ahead to them being visibly injured, the audience is smart enough to know what happened. Now, I want to expand the scope of this review beyond just this film, because when I was looking into information about Marighella, not just as a film, but the historical figure himself, I found that he wrote something called The Mini Manual of the Urban Guerrilla. This was such a good read. If you're a regular viewer of my videos, you will know that for a bit over a year now, I've been doing source material videos where there will be a film adaptation coming out, and before that film is released into cinemas, I will go and read the book that is the source material, and then I do a video on that book. And a massive reason of why I like to do those videos is just to promote libraries and encourage more people to go out and get library cards. Out of all of the books I've read this year so far, specifically for things that I've read that are related to entertainment media that I'm watching, This is very easily my favorite thing I've read. It's so much more interesting and compelling. I really wish the film had talked about Carlos Marighella writing this manual, or at least of developing his vision to write the manual. And no matter what nitpicks I might have about the film, I'm so glad that I finally got around to watching it, specifically because it led me to reading this manual. And what was particularly interesting to me about the timing of reading that was that I was away. I was pet sitting at a house where they had subscriptions to streaming platforms that I don't have, some because I would simply rather save the money and not have a million different subscriptions to things. But anyway, there was this show that I had added to my Letterboxd watch list called Say Nothing, and they do not have this show available to just buy directly or rent directly, such as on a platform like iTunes. Now, Say Nothing is a show about the Irish Republican Army, and I started watching that right after I had begun to read Carlos Marighella's manual. And even though he's writing about enacting armed struggle in Brazil, and Say Nothing is set in Ireland, I was very intrigued by how much overlap there was. Even just in things like Marighella explaining why banks are targeted and that you need to announce yourself to the people in the bank and explain why you're taking funds from the bank. There's a scene in Marighella where that happens. There's a scene in O que é isso, compañero, where that happens. And sure enough, there was a scene in Say Nothing where they basically do the exact same thing. But it really goes to show the interconnected nature of revolution. It's connected across all these different places. I can watch an anti-imperialist movie or series from China, Ireland, Brazil, Chile, and they will inevitably have some sort of connected tissue. Also, I did go and check out the Say Nothing source material book from the library so that I can read this too. Now tell me why, when I was looking up some of the basic trivia about Carlos Marighella, I saw that he went to China to learn about revolution. Why would you not put that in the movie? Can we have a different movie about that part of his life? Because Marighella already has overlap with O que é isso, compañero, and that was very interesting to find out while I was watching the film. So just gather some Brazilians, some Chinese historians, workshop this part of Marighella's life, and develop it into a film. You could make it an international collaborative project, and I am ready to watch that whenever it's ready. I know this review was quick, but I did make it in a hurry. I haven't decided which Brazilian film or film starring a Brazilian I will do next in this ongoing series, but feel free to put recommendations in the comments. To be honest, it probably won't happen until 2026, and there's a very specific reason for that. The honest truth, it's a lot more difficult for me to concentrate on being organized with my schedule of new theatrical releases I'm planning on reviewing, source material books I'm going to either talk about on YouTube or Patreon, when we have a new Avatar film coming out in a couple of months. James Cameron's Avatar films make most of their money at the box office outside of the Imperial Core. And do you know why? Because the Global South relates to the Nafi. They know who the Sky People really are. Anyway, recommendations are welcome, but I would prefer to not have to watch something where an animal dies. That's my one request. What about One Man's War? Should we watch that? That one is about Paraguay, but Fernanda Torres is in it. It is on my watch list, so Brazilians, what do we think? Do we like that one? Do we do something else? Either way, just let me know.